Hi, I'm Laura. I'm one of the co-founders of DORA.report. We're a regulatory reporting platform for the DORA regulation. So just a quick disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, so the interpretation of the regulation in this talk is my own, but I will provide the articles of the regulation that I'm talking about in the slides. So if you like to read regulation in your spare time, you can do that tonight. So today I'll cover the relevant parts of DORA for SREs. So we'll touch a bit on digital operational resilience testing, third-party risk management, but we'll mostly cover the incident management parts of DORA. So what's DORA, right? If you Google this, you're likely to get DORA the Explorer as your first hit, and that's not very useful. Or you'll get the DevOps DORA, which you guys are probably very familiar with. But today we'll be talking about the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which is an EU regulation that came into force this year in January. And if you are a financial entity that operates within the European Union, you'll be subjected to DORA. But what's interesting about this regulation is that all the critical third-party providers to the financial entities are also in scope for this regulation. So if you are a cryptocurrency provider, asset provider, or a tier 1 bank, or a big pension provider, you'll be in scope for this regulation. And as with any financial regulation, there are fines for non-compliance. But your third-party providers, if they're critical, they will also be subjected to fines as well if they aren't compliant to this regulation. You'll often hear about DORA summarized as 5 key pillars, and these are really like a way to say what the themes of this regulation are. So it talks about ICT risk management, incident management, classification and reporting, operational resilience testing, third-party risk management, information sharing agreements. And as I said earlier, we'll mostly be talking about incident management, classification, and reporting. We'll touch on op-res testing, and we'll also talk a bit about third-party risk management. So if we start with digital operational resilience testing, one of the key things to understand is what your critical and important functions are. And this is the regulatory definition, and it's pretty wordy and long. So if we simplify this, we can ask ourselves, what are the core offerings or processes that, if they fail, would severely impact your company's ability to operate, or it will hinder you from meeting your regulatory obligations? So once you know what your critical and important functions are, then as SREs, you can start looking at what your critical services that underpin these important functions are, right? And some companies may be way ahead. If you're already regulated by the FCA, you may already have a list of your important business functions that you have. But maybe you aren't there yet. Maybe you need to work with your product managers and your senior stakeholders to think about what your critical and important functions are, so then you can go on to define your critical services. And once you have these critical services, you might be using a service catalog and surfacing these to your developers. And you might be able to tag these critical services to say that they are in scope for DORA. And why is this important? Well, you need to understand what these critical important functions are in order to understand what you need to test as part of DORA for your operational resiliency testing. And you're expected to test this on a yearly basis. And some of you might be really advanced. You might be doing chaos engineering in your production environments and taking down services, and it's all magical and amazing, and your infrastructure self-healing. But then your challenges might be, how do I evidence this to the regulator in an easily understandable way? But some of you might be still working in your companies, like doing pen and paper exercises and planning scenarios and saying, if this fails, then this might happen. But the regulators are looking for companies to move towards production testing for their services. So how do you start building that risk tolerance in your companies to start doing these scenario testing in production-like environments? And there is also a need to start testing with your critical third-party providers that underpin your important functions. So do you know which of your critical providers underpin these functions? And how do you start planning to test with them? And this can be challenging for the third-party providers because you might work with a lot of financial entities, and your financial entities might all have different scenarios. So how do you carve out time to test with all of these financial entities? But if you're a financial entity, you might have a lot of critical third-party providers, and you also need to start thinking of how you can test with all of these third-party providers and build a scalable way of testing, and how can you automate this going forward. And I just want to touch on threat-led penetration testing. So it's unlikely the SREs will be carrying this out or organizing this, but you might have to work with your security departments for the preparation of these penetration tests, because they will be carried out in production environments and they may impact your SLOs. And if we move on to third-party risk management, some of you might have already started filling out this register of information and submitted it to your competent authorities already. But this is essentially a catalog of all of your third-party providers and your critical and your non-critical ones. And this will be sent to your competent authority on a yearly basis. So once you have a new critical third-party provider, you will update this register, and then you'll send this to your competent authority. And for those who don't know what a competent authority is essentially who regulates you within that EU member state. So if we're in Dublin at the moment, and if you are a bank that works in Dublin, your competent authority would be the Central Bank of Ireland. So if you are onboarding any new vendors that underpin a critical function, you will need to then also let your competent authority know. So just bear this in mind if you're working with teams and you're starting to select new vendors. This is a part of the process that you'll have to carry out. And when you think about third-party risk, do you know how these third parties fail? Are you monitoring them? Do you know how they potentially could cause you a service disruption? The contracts with your third-party providers, your legal teams are probably updating those contracts to ensure that you can break those contracts with them easily if your third-party providers are not compliant with DORA or other regulations. And if you are having those contracts terminated, do you have an exit strategy, right? If you have to move off that third-party provider, are you going to bring that particular service in-house, or are you going to move to another vendor? And if you are going to move to another vendor, have you tested this? Like, most of us are not going to be running, for example, 2 CDNs in production because it's not financially feasible and it's not practical, right? So if you are failing over to another vendor, is that going to meet your basic requirements to maintain the service level that you need? Are you going to be able to serve your customers when you carry out that failover? So moving on to incident management. I was chatting with some engineering leads that had implemented DORA into their companies, and some of them were saying that raising incidents have now become so complicated with the addition of DORA requirements that their developers are actually scared to raise incidents. And that's really where we don't want to be, right? We don't want to have our teams fearful of raising incidents because there's some regulation that has come in. We want it to be easy for them to carry on doing their job and raising incidents. So we think about, we have an SRE, and his name is Andy. And he works in a payments team in fintech, and he operates in the European Union. And Andy gets paged, right? He's on call, he has a high priority alert. He wakes up, and he has to think about a lot of things. He has to understand whether this is an internal severity 1 incident, what are my playbooks that I have to look at, what are the dashboards that I have to pull up, and I have to kick off my incident management process, right? But he's also received some training that he also has to do this DORA stuff. And he needs to think through that checklist that he's received in his training. So he has to ask himself, what's our internal DORA incident process? What do I have to do for this DORA incident classification? And is this a recurring incident? And is that DORA major? And does this incident originate from a third-party provider? And do I have to do the aggregated reporting thing? And also understanding what are all those DORA reporting timelines that he has to adhere to. So we start looking at what's our internal DORA incident process. You don't probably need to change much of your original tooling or processing already. You'll raise an incident using a Slack workflow or whatever tools you have in your company already. And then you'll probably go on to categorize the incident. So you'll take your incident definition and say, OK, this is a Sev 1. But then you also have the DORA incident severities that you need to look at. And it will be dependent on the company. Would you decide to merge all of these incident definitions into one and try and make that understandable? Or will you keep them as 2 separate things that your incident responder has to do? And then you'll probably assign some roles and responsibilities. So you'll probably have a scribe, for example, or a major incident manager. But for DORA, you might want to also loop in your compliance team because they may hold that relationship with that competent authority. But you also might want to loop in your security operations team because for DORA major incidents, one of the criteria is that if you have unauthorized network access, then you need to report this as DORA. And there's also a crisis management aspect to this. So you might need to loop in your senior management and stakeholders to handle that crisis management. And there's also a requirement to let your senior stakeholders know that DORA major incidents have happened, and you need to let them know what the remediations actions were on the back of that. So if we go back to Andy, Andy has kicked off his incident procedure. He has said that this is a Sev 1 incident according to his internal incident definitions. Fantastic. Now he has to move on to that DORA incident classification. So is it a DORA major incident or is it not? And just a side note, you can reclassify these incidents for your reporting. So if you report it as DORA major and then you decide it's not later on, you can downgrade it. And then he has to ask himself, does this incident impact those critical and important functions that we talked about earlier? So criteria A is, does the incident impact those critical services? Criteria B is, does the incident impact any services that require authorization or your competent authority has specifically called out that those services are being supervised? Or does it meet criteria C, where the incident results in malicious or unauthorized access to the network? And if it doesn't meet any of these, like, you're golden, like it's not a DORA major incident, go on and carry on with your incident response, right? But if you meet criteria C, so there has been unauthorized access to your network, then it is a DORA major incident automatically. So whether it's an SRE that is like looking at the logs for unauthorized network access, or whether it's your security operations team, decide who is going to manage this type of incident. But then if you meet criteria A or B, there are actually more classification criteria, and this is where it gets a bit more complicated, I guess, because there are 6 additional criteria, and we'll go through each of them. And the first one is the most nuanced, which is around reputational impact. So has your incident been shown in the media? Have you received repetitive complaints about this particular incident, either by your customers or by other financial counterparts? Would it mean that you won't meet any regulatory requirements? Or would you start losing clients as a result of this incident? And this is really difficult to start showing any sort of metrics to your incident responder immediately. It may be something that you start having to look at post-incident to determine whether this has had reputational impact. So I think this is one of the most nuanced criteria. But criteria 2 is a lot simpler, and this should be bread and butter, right? It's just the duration of the incident and the service downtime. So if your incident is more than 24 hours long, or the service has been down for more than 2 hours, then this criteria will be met. So you can probably have a notification to your incident responder to say, hey, this incident has been going on for 2 hours now, like it's met the criteria for, one of the criteria for DORA major. And then geographical spread. Again, like if you just operate in one EU member state, so you operate in France, or for example, then you're fine. You won't likely hit this geographical spread criteria. But if you work in more than 2 member states, then you might be subjected to this if all of your infrastructure serves the same regions, right? But maybe you do split your architecture differently. Maybe Germany is a completely different stack from France. So if you push a version update to Germany, France may not be impacted. And how can you easily surface this to your incident responders about which regions are impacted by a particular incident? And then moving on to data losses, I think some of these are quite easy to show some metrics to your end user. Like if your database is down for a critical service, you're likely to have that metric already in your toolbox. But some of the other ones, like has the data integrity been compromised? Has there been unauthorized access to your databases? You might, again, have to work with your security teams to pull out the metrics to surface to an incident responder to understand whether they need to classify this as a data loss or not. And then economic impact. So if the costs and losses of the incident is more than 100,000 euros, then this criteria will be fulfilled. And again, how do you know at the beginning of an incident what the loss will be, right? Like it's very, very hard to quantify this. It's probably not even what you're thinking about, like at the beginning of an incident. So I think, again, this is one that you probably have to go back and calculate the cost at the end. But you could also maybe run some scenarios with your product teams to say that these are the likely scenarios for a DORA major incident, and this is what the potential costs are going to be. For example, we had a talk about from Allegro the other day about, honey, I shrunk my data center, and their data center set on fire, right? So like that's probably going to be a major incident if that's your scenario. And you can probably calculate how much that would cost you to replace that data center. And then criteria 6, clients, financial counterparts, and transactions. And these are business metrics that you are likely to have already. So the volume of transactions that your company has, the value of these transactions, the number of clients that are impacted. So you're likely to have these metrics already. So how can you surface these in an easy way for your incident responder so they can take a glance and know whether this criteria has been fulfilled or not? And just to call out that when we're talking about transactions, it's where at least one part of that transaction is carried out in the European Union. So if, say, for example, a transaction starts in the US but then passes through the EU, this transaction will still be in scope for DORA. So how do you surface that to your end users? How do you pick these types of transactions out if you are a global company? And finally, if more than 2 of these additional criteria are met, then it's classed as DORA major, alongside that criteria A and B that we talked about. So that's a lot of criteria. And if you're an incident responder, you probably in the middle of the night don't want to be like kind of trying to remember all of this and trying to understand whether it is a DORA major. So what can you do to build some simplicity into your incident response so that it's easy for your incident responders to be able to classify these incidents? Maybe it's just a checklist that they have to go through, or maybe you can spend time doing something more intelligent. We've heard a lot about LLMs and in incident response over the last few days. So some people are building LLMs that can categorize their incidents internally. Can you extend this to also categorize incidents for DORA? How can you easily surface all the metrics that an incident responder needs in order to classify this and maybe give them some hints as to whether it could be a DORA major incident or not? And just to touch on recurring incidents, so if these criteria are met, then it's a DORA major incident. And the regulator expects that financial entities on a recurring, on any monthly basis, they look at whether their previous month's incidents are falling into this category of DORA major. So do you have already a monthly post-mortem meeting or post-incident meeting where you can also check back to see which classifies as a DORA major incident? So let's go back to Andy. Andy has started his classification. He knows that the incident impacts a number of critical services, so it meets criteria A. He also knows that it meets additional criteria because he works in Germany and France, and both regions are impacted. And he knows that greater than 10% of their clients have been impacted, and the greater than 10% of their average number of transactions have also been impacted. So he updates his incident channel. He says, this is a DORA major incident, but he also pulls in his SecOps guy because he's a bit worried that there's been some unauthorized network access. So Fred is off doing his security things and reporting back saying, don't worry, there's no unauthorized malicious access to the network. And then Andy thinks he can just focus on recovering services, right? Because that's what you do. But he also has to manage the crisis communication part, right? So is it your SRE that just updates the status page to inform your customers that you're down? Or do you have something more sophisticated? Do you have an obligation to inform your customers, like, sorry, you can't access your money today? Or do you have to inform your other financial counterparts? Sorry, we're like your backbone financial service provider, but we won't be able to operate today either, so they can carry on with their mitigations. And do you have to do anything with regards to the media, right, in terms of communication? For Andy, he's quite lucky because they have a follow the sun model. He has someone that works 24 hours on call, so he pulls in Mel to do crisis communications. And he thinks, okay, I can start doing my recovery on my services. But no, he gets another reminder, and it says, your initial notification is due. And he's like, God, what is this again? Like, so who's responsible for reporting for DORA in your company, right? Is it Jane from compliance? Does she manage that relationship with the competent authority? Or if the initial notification pings in the middle of the night, is it your SRE that has to complete this notification? So as part of DORA for major incidents, you have to complete 3 reports. You have an initial notification, an intermediate report, and a final report. And the clock starts ticking once you have declared this incident as a major incident, right? So the competent authority wants this initial notification as soon as possible, within 4 hours, but no later than 24 hours. And then after you've submitted that, the intermediate report you need to submit within 72 hours, and the final report within 1 month. So just a side note, if this falls on a weekend or bank holiday, most companies won't have to file these reports until noon the next working day, but some institutions are an exemption. If you're a credit institution or they've classified you as an important financial entity, you don't have that luxury. You have to have on-call coverage over weekends and bank holidays. So bear that in mind. And so again, the initial notifications, the competent authorities are not being a pain. They don't want you to submit this and like delay your recovery just because they're being annoying. They want this because if there is a major outage in one financial entity, it might cascade across the financial market, right? So they want to be able to inform other financial entities if there is an emergency, and then they can do an EU-wide coordinated response. So the contents of this, again, it's very simple information. It's like, when was the incident detected? What was the incident? And which member states were impacted? It's that information you can pull out from your incident channel easily. And then when we talk about the intermediate report, this has a bit more content. It's a bit beefier, and it's more of a collaborative effort. So as SREs, you probably don't want to be responsible for completing this, but you want to hand this off to your compliance team. But the kind of information that you'll be expected to pull out is when were the services recovered? What infrastructure was impacted? And what measures did you take to recover the incident, right? And so this should be relatively easy, again, to surface this information. But just bear in mind that if you haven't recovered within 72 hours, you will need to still file this intermediate report. And then after that has been filed, and after you've recovered your service, you need to file another report. So you file the intermediate report. And then finally, the final report. Again, this is a bigger report. It's a collaborative effort. But you can leverage a lot of that information from your post-incident reports or your retrospectives if you use that terminology. So this is like the root cause of your incident, more about the resolution. These are like easily surfaceable. So it's worth actually reading through the final report and potentially picking out all of the bits that are relevant to SRE and maybe updating your existing post-incident templates to cover the questions that you're likely to be asked so that you can then easily surface this to your compliance teams when they start asking you for this information. And like I said, it's a collaborative effort because there's a lot about costs and losses. So how much did this incident cost your company? So someone from finance may have to be involved. And again, someone from security operations might need to be involved because of unauthorized network access. So it really pulls together a lot of people from your company in order to complete this report. And just to touch on aggregated reporting, I know we mentioned that, Andy mentioned that as part of his process. If you have a major third-party provider outage, so maybe I'll pick on CrowdStrike last year, and that impacts a bunch of different financial entities. I don't think the competent authority wants every bank telling them that CrowdStrike has an outage, because that's not very useful. That's just really like spam, right? But instead, your third-party provider, like CrowdStrike, can report themselves on behalf of the banks that they have impacted or the financial entities that they have impacted to say that we as CrowdStrike, we have had an outage and this is what happened. So check your contractual clauses or check with your compliance team that manage the contractual clauses which third-party providers are doing this aggregated reporting on your behalf. Because then if you have detection to say that CrowdStrike is down, your incident responder doesn't need to then worry about the reporting, right? They know that CrowdStrike will do that on your behalf, and then you can focus on incident response and resolution. So that was a whistle-stop tour of DORA, the relevant bits, I think, for SRE. And I hope you can take away some ideas of how to simplify this process for your engineering team so that raising a DORA major incident is not something that is really complicated, but they are comfortable with doing. Thank you.